The Omnipotent Self, a study in self-deception and self-cure by Paul Bousfield. Part 1, The Omnipotent Self. Chapter 5, Narcissism. The term narcissism has already been mentioned, and some slight indication of its importance in character development has been given. We have also examined the derivative of the term and found that it implies self-interest, self-importance, self-worship, all of which characteristics are in modified degrees possessed by everybody. There are, however, many other manifestations of narcissism, many tricks by which it gets past our conscious intentions, many ways in which it associates itself with other instincts and unknown to us works our undoing. We shall, therefore, in this chapter examine the development of narcissism from its very earliest stages and trace out in some detail whither it may lead. Most people, were they asked at what moment the child's mind first began to register feelings, thoughts, and emotions, would probably at once and without hesitation say, at the moment of birth. It seems the obvious thing to say, but like many other obvious things, such a statement appears to have but little evidence in support of it and much against it. The act of birth has performed no sudden or miraculous change upon the growth and tissues of the body. It is true that oxygen is now absorbed through the lungs instead of as originally through the mother's blood, but the essential tissues, the brain, the muscles, and the bones have undergone no sudden change. Before birth, they were living tissues, and we know that the muscles were at work, for we had felt the baby's movements in utero. We know that the heart was at work, driving the blood through the child's arteries. We had learnt this also by means of the stethoscope many weeks before the child was born. Why then should we assume that the brain had registered nothing at birth? We do indeed know that it must have been at work, in part, for it was learning to regulate the action of the child's heart and the child's secretions, the blood pressure and the motion of its limbs. We are therefore justified in assuming that it must be capable of registering impressions, even though it were incapable of reason or thought. It is true that at birth it commences to undergo many vivid new experiences, but that is no reason for assuming that it has not undergone any experiences in utero, and that these experiences have not made some impressions on the brain. Let us see for a moment what impressions it is likely to have received and registered. First of all, it would most certainly hear sounds, the sounds of the blood rushing through the mother's arteries, and the sounds of the outer world, muffled and indistinct when they had penetrated the mother's body. All these sounds would be of a soft, crooning nature, and those caused by the blood in the mother's arteries would be of a rhythmic, humming, rising, and falling nature. A kind of rhythmic lullaby, very similar in many respects to the lullaby the mother would hum to the child when she wishes to put it to sleep at a later period. We should expect these sounds to be registered on the child's brain so that if it ever heard their like again, some chord of feeling memory would be struck and some emotional association brought to mind. In the second place, external movements would be registered on the child's mind as the mother walked about. There would be a swaying or swinging movement. Again, we should expect that when, in afterlife, the child experienced a swaying or swinging movement, a chord of memory would be touched again, and these earlier associations would be revived, not as a conscious memory or fact, of course, but as a feeling. Again, conscious movements of its own limbs might be impressed upon it. It would find when it tried to move that its movements were limited, and that it attained more perfect peace by refraining from attempting to struggle and change its position. It would be impressed by the pleasantness of inertia as opposed to the unpleasantness of making an effort. And finally, its general position with its knees drawn up and the chin bent down would be firmly registered, so that when in afterlife it again assumed this position, once more the chord of memory would be struck, and the old feeling of repose would be likely to return. Now, we cannot assume that the child has any active mental state before its birth, but we know that its condition, taken in conjunction with its extremely limited experience, is one as near omnipotence from its standpoint as may be. It breathes, or rather absorbs oxygen without any effort of breathing. It is fed, it is kept warm and comfortable without any effort whatsoever. It lives in a world entirely its own, where everything works together for its comfort and well-being. It has to make no struggle for existence. It has to deal with nothing real, save perhaps that its voluntary movements are limited. And this perhaps is bad for its education, since at that period of its life it learns that it can be most comfortable by making least effort. And here we see the beginning of that which we all possess in afterlife: inertia, the difficulty of making a beginning at anything, the objection which we have to making efforts. Now let us see what happens to this omnipotent little creature at birth. It goes through the probably painful process of having its position roughly changed and being thrust into an atmosphere which is cold and unusual to it. Moreover, it has to make its first struggle for breath, its first effort to sustain existence. And in its struggle for breath, it utters cries, which by experience it very soon finds to be magic sounds which enable it to fulfill its wishes. But of this more later. After its first rude awakening, let us once more see what happens. It is wrapped up in something warm, that is, it is returned to a semblance of the womb by having something round it which keeps out the cold. It is gently rocked to and fro by the nurse or other attendant, and again the semblance of the previous rocking in the womb is returned to it. Crooning sounds are murmured over it, and the semblance is still more complete. It frequently draws its knees up somewhat if it is placed in such a position that it can do so with ease and falls asleep. It has attained as nearly as possible once more the semblance of its pre-birth condition, where it has no cares and is warm and comfortable again. And though it has become acquainted with effort, it is quite obvious that its feeling of omnipotence, if we may so term it for the moment, is hardly yet disturbed, and the world it has come into differs but slightly from the world which it has left. It is still a world in which the infant is the center and ruler, in which its every want is attended to without an effort on its part, save that it may sometimes have to call attention to its wants by means of that magical cry, which it soon learns how and when to use, and which acts in a truly magical manner in accomplishing the fulfillment of all its desires. During the first few weeks of the infant's life, this delusion on the part of the child is largely kept up. Few people think there is any harm in attending to all a baby's wants in the first month of its life. They do not think it could possibly be wrong to spoil it at that age, because its intellect has not developed. They forget entirely that its mental condition and attitude towards life, apart from actual thought, may inevitably be affected at this period. Hence, whenever the baby cries, it is not uncommonly rocked to sleep or fed, or if it holds out its hand and shows its desire to possess a thing, it is immediately allowed to possess it. And to play with it, it has to make but the faintest attempts to adjust itself to its environment. It has to face but the slightest reality, all its desires are immediately fulfilled and kept in a condition of almost continual fulfillment. And it may remain for a considerable period, as near being an omnipotent creature as it is possible for any living thing to be. Its omnipotence, however, is really a fallacy, or as I prefer to term it at a slightly later stage, a fantasy. For the world in which it lived before birth, which seemed to it as a world, was not really a world at all, but a very small and very temporary abode. And the world in which it is living for the first few months after birth is again not really a world, but a combination of extremely limited and carefully selected portions of the world in which every attempt is made to disguise it from the realities of the actual world. Again, let us emphasize the fact that the chief effort that the infant has to make is the effort of crying. And it may learn very quickly that this is so all-powerful as to practically efface the unpleasant task of having to adjust itself to the realities of life. This process is carried on with slight modifications for many months. The infant has but to wave a magic wand, as it were, has but to emit a little magic noise from its mouth, and all the world it knows is set in motion to give it satisfaction and some semblance of its pre-birth omnipotence. This cry, which brings it gratification, if it has been really effective over a too prolonged period, will tend to fix permanently in the child's mind the fact that either weeping or making a magic noise with the mouth will always attain for it gratification. And although at a later stage the conscious mind will be obliged to accept a considerable amount of reality and to reject the idea of omnipotence, yet the unconscious mind will persist in the struggle and will make futile efforts to forget reality, to change reality into fantasy, and to regain its omnipotent state. When a man uses explicitives because some task of his has failed to result in success, he is really repeating the infant's cry. He is really uttering a magic sound which his unconscious mind hopes may somehow remedy the failure. He has not definitely accepted the reality of failure as a commonplace, hard fact of life at the moment at which he utters his explicitive. When a person weeps at some unpleasant happening or in anger at something which has touched his pride, exactly the same is taking place. He or she has failed to make a complete adaptation of himself to the facts and realities of life. He has obeyed the law of regression, to which I referred in a previous chapter, and has returned to the infantile method of expression, namely weeping, with the unconscious hope that a magic compensation will result, that instead of his having to adapt himself to the facts of life will somehow adapt themselves to his fantasy. Hence, the first piece of advice that one must give to parents is that they should, from the earliest possible moment, train the infant to understand that the magic cries will not at once produce their expected result. And the first week in the infant's life is all important in this matter. The choosing of the nurse who has charge during that period should be done with great care, and what is required of her should be insisted on. Too great emphasis cannot be laid upon these points. The child should be fed at regular and proper intervals and should be kept warm. But if it cries, as it will do naturally, it should be left to itself to cry. It should not be picked up, rocked to sleep, given another meal, or petted. If it is left to cry, it will learn very rapidly and at the right period of its life that the sounds which it emits are not magical, and it will begin to adapt itself to the fact that it lives in a real world which has not been built solely and only for its own delight. It is curious to note how regression, this instinct to return to the earlier mode of expression, to return apparently even to the pre-birth state, persists in the unconscious mind. During the war, I knew a youth who was intensely agitated by the air raids. He felt perfectly safe, however, if he could crawl under the bed or table where he would curl himself into practically the same position as that of a normal baby before birth. When questioned, he had not, of course, the slightest conscious knowledge of why he felt safe in such curious circumstances, but it does not seem improbable that the association of ideas produced by his position and by the confined space created a feeling akin to that feeling of safety which has been his in his pre-birth omnipotent position where nothing could harm him. A similar feeling of security was experienced by many normal persons in cellars and other confined spaces and was probably of the same origin. For there is no doubt that this safety was felt even though their reason told them that a bomb was as likely to reach their confined space as any other place in the neighborhood. Again, I know of innumerable cases in which soldiers felt very much safer from bombs which fell at night when they were under cover of a canvas tent. Logically, of course, the thing was absurd. Emotionally, it was a fact, and all were equally unconscious of any possible reasons for the feeling of security produced. An example of this same tendency at an earlier age is seen in children who cover their heads with the bedclothes when they are frightened. To return to our narcissistic infant, we are now impressed with the fact that one thing of the utmost importance in the first years of its life is that it shall gradually come into contact with reality, shall discover that all things do not belong to it, that its omnipotent feelings are based purely upon fantasy and not upon reality, and upon the method of its disillusionment, and the age at which this begins largely depend the future powers of adaptation of the child to its surroundings. It has now become obvious that the newborn infant lives in a world of fantasy, in which the relative importance of itself to things outside itself is not merely distorted, but is entirely absent. And if we can suppose a child kept artificially in this condition till it reached adult life, every wish satisfied instantaneously, every force it knows directed entirely towards gratifying its immediate desires, we do not require much imagination to understand how absolutely helpless and lost this omnipotent creature would be if suddenly turned into the world to face life and reality. His one desire would be to return to his omnipotent state, his one effort to keep at bay reality and turn it into the pleasant fantasy of the previous 20 years. For he would surely, before his delusionment, have really come to believe himself omnipotent, the only real thing in a fantasy world of his own fashioning and dreaming. An extreme case of this kind is, of course, an impossibility, but there are many and various degrees in which it is approached. Probably the nearest approach to it may be found in cases where some sort of moral or mental conflict has been too much for an extremely narcissistic mind, which has then completely regressed, refusing to recognize the outer world and developed a certain form of insanity, and from this stage of complete narcissistic regression, all degrees and kinds of manifestations of it may be found. Until we reach at the other end of our list a person who expects everyone around to consult his wishes and peculiarities, or who is merely somewhat impatient or inclined to irritability, or merely oversensitive to either mental or physical pain. There is no more certain fact than that if an infant be allowed to postpone its acquaintance with reality too long, it becomes fixed in a more or less degree in conditions in which fantasy plays too prominent a part, and regression of some kind takes place as it meets with real difficulties. End of chapter 5.